Before the Ayutthaya kings, before the golden temples of Chiang Mai or the silver stupas of Luang Prabang, there was another power, older, colder, and merciless. From the moated heart of Angkor, the Khmer Empire reached outward like a storm of stone and blood. Its god-kings ruled, not just with armies, but with divine right, casting their shadows into the mountains of Laos and across the rivers of Thailand. But these were no empty lands. They were sacred places, guarded by spirits, warlords, and ancestral blood. What began as pilgrimage soon turned to conquest. Temples rose where forests once breathed. Villages vanished under highways of laterite and obsidian. The Mekong, once a lifeline, became a warpath. Yet for all its glory, the Khmer did not walk unopposed. Hill clans rebelled, river lords fought in silence, and across the mountains, new kingdoms watched, waiting for the moment Angkor would stumble. This story is not about ruins, it is about the people who once walked among them. This is the forgotten war that carved the map of mainland Southeast Asia, a war of gods, rice, and fire. Part 1. Jungle Thrones and River Gods. They came not as visitors, but as omens. From the south, they moved in silence. Columns of Khmer warriors, wrapped in cloth dyed with ochre and ash, escorted by Brahmin priests and stonemasons. Their shadows stretched long across the Mekong, through the mist-heavy valleys of modern-day Laos, and into the sunburnt plains of what would one day be Thailand. They carried no flags, only the weight of the gods and the will of the empire. The Khmer were builders. Wherever they went, they did not simply conquer, they transformed. Jungle trails became laterite roads, spirit forests were stripped bare for stone, rivers were bent into reservoirs, and mountaintops were crowned with shrines. The men who came from Angkor did not believe they were invaders. They believed they were civilizing forgotten lands, fulfilling cosmic law through the vision of the Chakravartin, the universal king. But the land did not yield quietly. Before the Khmer, these hills belonged to lords of mist and fire. In what we now call Laos, ancient tribal confederations like the Khmer and Muang held sway. Animist chieftains and spirit masters who communed with rivers and buried their kings in tree roots. In the Korat Plateau, powerful city-states aligned with Devaravati traditions, where early Theravada monks guarded relics and offered rice to their dead. These were not backward peoples. They had systems of kingship. They practiced agriculture, and they carved their beliefs into copper and stone. But they did not build like the Khmer, and that made them targets. The expansion began slowly, under kings who viewed the north not as a threat, but as a frontier. Jayavarman II had established divine rule in Angkor. His successors, particularly Rajendravarman and Suryavarman, the first, saw conquest not merely as ambition, but as religious duty. The mountains and rivers to the north were believed to be sacred veins of the earth, channels of Dharma that needed to be aligned with the cosmic order of Angkor. And so the first incursions began, disguised as temple missions. Priests were sent to Luang Prabang bearing gifts, golden idols, palm leaf manuscripts, and offers of spiritual union. Local rulers who accepted were absorbed, granted Khmer titles, and incorporated into the imperial web. Those who refused were marked. By the mid-11th century, Khmer military columns were marching into the Enomate Mountains, not in sweeping battles, but in calculated strikes. Fortress cities like Wat Pho were reinforced, transformed from simple sanctuaries into military hubs. The city of Champasak became a focal point, both spiritual and strategic, towering over the landscape. The mountain temple of Wat Pho was dedicated to Shiva, but served also as a watchtower over the Mekong. From there, Khmer forces launched deeper campaigns into tribal zones, dismantling resistance village by village. Yet conquest was never total. The jungle fought back in ways that armies could not. Disease gnawed at Khmer troops. Flooded terrain turned elephants mad. Ghost stories spread among soldiers, tales of cursed groves and ancestral spirits that dragged men into the river by their breath. Commanders consulted astrologers more than generals. Battles were delayed to wait for omens. Every move northward was matched by a whisper from the trees. You do not belong here. In what is now northeast Thailand, resistance took a different shape. The Devaravati cities were not mere outposts. They were centers of Buddhist learning, trade, and diplomacy. Nakhon Pathom, Lopburi, and Sukhothai were cultural rivals to Angkor long before their conquest. When Suryavarman expanded into this region, he did so through political marriage and strategic violence. Local kings were offered Khmer princesses in exchange for tribute. Roads were built to connect them to the heart of Angkor, but they ran both ways, bringing soldiers and tax collectors north, and laborers and artisans south. Behind the grand campaigns were everyday lives transformed forever. In the village rice fields of the Korat Plateau, elders who once prayed to local guardian spirits were forced to convert their shrines to Shiva or Vishnu. Children learned to speak Khmer alongside their native dialects. Taxes were collected in rice and labor. Men were drafted to build temples for gods they did not name, carving sandstone images of battles they never fought. Resistance became a quiet thing, songs sung in secret, ancestors honored in forbidden rituals, and shrines hidden behind water buffalo pens. Yet not all was force. The allure of Angkor was real. For many northern elites, becoming Khmer meant wealth. Trade expanded. Khmer irrigation techniques increased crop yields. Roads brought foreign goods, from Chinese porcelain to Indian dyes. The empire was not just a conqueror, it was a system, a machine that consumed but also enriched. The question for many local leaders was not whether to resist, but how to survive. As Angkor's power solidified in the 12th century, Jayavarman VII emerged not just as a king, but as a force of nature. Having driven out the Khams to the east, he turned his vision back northward. His was a different kind of conquest, cloaked in compassion, draped in stone. He built dharmasalas, rest houses along the roads for travelers and pilgrims. He raised hospitals and sanctuaries in the borderlands, places where the Khmer promise of civilization was laid bare for all to see. In cities like Phi Mai and Lung Sing, Khmer architecture rivaled that of Angkor itself. Massive towers, moated enclosures, and symmetrical city plans imposed order upon the wild, but the cost was steep. Entire populations were relocated to serve in temple construction. Tribute demands drained local grain stores. Roads meant more than trade, they meant surveillance. Each step forward tightened the web, and beneath it all, the jungle still waited. In the highlands of Laos, the last free chieftains clung to independence. They retreated into the mountains, beyond the reach of elephants and chariots. Some forged alliances with Daeviet factions to the east. Others turned to animist, sorcery, and guerrilla warfare. Ambushes became common along Khmer roads. Supply lines vanished overnight. Jayavarman VII sent patrols, but they found only bones and ritual markings, warnings scrawled in blood and bark. These were not battles fought in open fields. They were wars of attrition, of spirits versus steel. Still, the Khmer pressed on. By the end of the 12th century, the empire's reach extended across much of present-day Laos and Thailand. Temples stood like sentinels across the landscape, silent, symmetrical, watching, but beneath their foundations were old gods, buried but not broken. The Khmer believed they had brought order to chaos, that the jungles were now tamed, the rivers now theirs, but they had mistaken silence for submission. In the shadows of the temples, new powers were rising. Part 2. Cities beneath the banyan. The empire of Angkor was at its height, and the world around it bent under its gravity. In the north, where the mountains of Laos stood like ancient teeth, and the plains of Thailand stretched flat and endless, Khmer outposts bloomed like moss after rain. Great cities rose where jungle had ruled. Phi Mai, Sukhothai, Muang Sing. Each stone laid in these cities bore not just the weight of architecture, but ideology. These were not just towns, they were statements, proof that the gods of Angkor reigned here too. But even stone has a shadow. As Khmer banners flew over river valleys and mountain passes, something stirred beneath. Hidden within the banyan forests, in places where Angkor's roads faded into vine and mud, new cities were forming. Cities not carved in imitation, but in resistance. Phimai stood as the northernmost beacon of Khmer ambition. Its temple complex mirrored the style of Angkor Wat, axial symmetry, elevated sanctums, guardian lions carved in volcanic rock. It was both a fortress and a shrine, a declaration that the divine order of Angkor extended even to the edge of the world. And for a time, it worked. Trade flourished. Rice flowed in from tributary farms. The roads bustled with caravans and pilgrims. But all empires forget one thing. They rule only while they are believed to. Beneath the polished order of Khmer temples, local traditions simmered. The people of these regions had not erased their gods, they had hidden them. Behind the faces of Avalokiteshvara, old forest deities still lived. At the edges of reservoirs built by Khmer engineers, fishermen still whispered the names of serpent spirits. The rituals remained, buried under the architecture of obedience. And then came the break. No one empire, no matter how vast, can expand forever. As the 13th century dawned, the Khmer machine began to creak. The grand visions of Jayavarman VII gave way to rising taxes, military overreach, and internal exhaustion. The roads once paved with tribute now ran with desertion. The temples, once symbols of divine harmony, became hollow. In the north, the cities watched and waited. Sukhothai was the first to rise. It began as a vassal, a Khmer-controlled city whose rulers bore Sanskrit names and offered tribute to Angkor. But around 1238, its leaders declared independence. No bloodbath, no siege, just a proclamation, a reassertion of identity long suppressed. The local ruler, Sri Indraditya, renounced Khmer overlordship and founded a new dynasty. The language of the court shifted from Khmer and Sanskrit to an early form of Thai. Buddhist monastic orders that had once been under Khmer influence now forged their own paths, rooted in Theravada orthodoxy rather than Angkor's Mabeyana dominance. This was not rebellion through swords, it was rebellion through culture. Soon, other cities followed. In Phitsanulok, Chang, Sain, and the shadowed valleys of the north, the Khmer grip loosened. Temples once used for imperial propaganda were repurposed, inscriptions rewritten. The roads no longer led to Angkor, but away from it. Back in the jungles of Laos, the pattern was different, but the outcome was the same. Local chieftains, who had bent the knee under Jayavarman's vision of divine kingship, began to assert autonomy. The Mekong, once a Khmer lifeline, now divided as much as it connected. In Luang Prabang, fragments of the old Thai principalities began to unite, giving rise to what would become the Lanchang kingdom in the century to come. And though its early history remains veiled, we know this much. It was born in the space Khmer ambition could no longer reach. The collapse was not dramatic. Angkor did not burn, nor did it fall to a foreign army, not yet. Instead, it rotted. Tributary cities stopped sending rice. Governors declared themselves kings. The roads cracked. The reservoirs dried. And in the north, the banyan trees crept closer to the temples. In Phimai, the once proud Khmer citadel was slowly reclaimed by silence. Without reinforcements from the south, it could not resist the changing tides. Traders stopped coming. Farmers fled to safer provinces. By the late 13th century, Phimai had become a relic, a city still standing, but no longer alive. Yet the stones remained, silent, watching, waiting. The fall of Khmer power in Laos and Thailand did not mark the end of its influence. The temples it left behind became sacred again, though in new ways. Local kings claimed them as symbols of legitimacy, carving their own stories over the old ones. The reservoirs were reused, the roads repurposed. Khmer architecture became part of the DNA of new kingdoms, not as symbols of subjugation, but as tools for sovereignty. In this, the Khmer legacy was more complex than conquest or collapse. It became something else entirely: memory. And in that memory lived contradiction. The Khmer had brought oppression, yes, but also irrigation, writing, medicine, cosmology. They had brutalized the land, but they had also given it structure. What remained in Thailand and Laos was a hybrid, a region shaped by the empire, even as it rejected its rule. Centuries later, when European colonizers arrived, they asked the wrong questions. Who built these temples? Who ruled these lands? They could not understand that the answer was not one name, one people, one empire. It was layers, a palimpsest of dynasties and spirits, of carved faces and erased lines. The ruins did not speak to one history, they whispered many. Even today, you can walk among them, through Khmer's silent avenues, past the moss-lit walls of Wat Phu, or the scattered remnants of Muang Sing. The stones are cracked, the gods are faceless. But if you listen, truly listen, you can still hear the footsteps of Khmer soldiers crossing rivers. You can hear monks chanting in a language lost. You can hear the resistance in the trees. In the marketplaces of Thailand, echoes of Khmer script linger in words. In the rituals of Laos, fragments of old Brahmanical rites still survive. The empire is gone, but it was never buried. It lives in the soil, in the food, in the way the sun strikes the spires of old temples at certain angles no longer recorded in maps. The banyan trees have swallowed the cities, but they have not erased them. The story of the Khmer Empire's expansion into Laos and Thailand is not just a story of victory or defeat. It is a story of transformation, of how one empire's ambition shaped the destiny of entire regions, not always by force, but often through the slow erosion of time, memory, and belief. It is a story of how power spreads, how it fades, and how it echoes. And somewhere in the heart of the jungle, beneath centuries of leaves and ash, the old gods sleep. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.